You know, everybody is good at something. Now, sometimes what you're good at doesn't seem very useful. That can be the problem. Me, for instance, I remember obscure things, quotes from books and movies and songs that while I find them very interesting, no one else seems to care, and most people don't even find them very interesting. And I often think to myself, if I didn't know this junk, there'd be space in my brain so that I could know important things. Now, others of you, I understand, you're that person who knows important things. That's good. Or maybe we all just have lots of empty space in our brains. I don't know. In the workplace, we would all be human resources. Human resources. And the idea in human resources is to get you doing something that you're good at. A guy by the name of Ed McManus wrote a classic book about human resources. And in his book, he describes how people get assigned to different jobs at work based on what they seem to be good at. And here's what he says. He says a group of new employees, and this could be you come to a company and you come into the office, and he says, first, if you're senior management, you bring all the employees in, and you leave them in the conference room for 4 hours. For 4 hours. And then you go back and see what they're doing, and you decide kind of what job they should have. So when you come back to the conference room, if they don't look up when you walk in the room, you get assigned to the security department. He said if they're counting the cigarette butts in the ashtray, they go directly to finance. If they've broken the table, send them to engineering. If they're scribbling on the table, send them to technical documents. If they're complaining about being left in the conference room too long, assign them to public relations. If they left early, put them in sales. And if they have fallen asleep, they go directly to senior management. Everybody's good at something, and even better than that, everybody is gifted by God to do something essential to Jesus' mission in this world and useful for His kingdom and the building of His kingdom. And I think church is kind of like that conference room. So after I keep you here for about 4 hours this morning, we're going to know exactly what you're good at. Now, we know already that God has called you to be part of His mission in this world, and that's a necessary part of being Jesus' disciple. To follow Jesus is to be involved in His mission. It's not something additional. It's not extra credit, if you get that. My son, Sam, told me this story after his first semester at college. He had a biology class, and he didn't really like the biology class. He didn't really feel confident in biology, but the biology professor had this sort of aversion to people who would skip his class. So it's a big kind of lecture class, and a lot of people would only show up for the test, and that made this professor very angry. And so what the professor would do is just sort of indiscriminately on any given day, he would give extra credit to the people who showed up. And Sam said, in fact, one time he changed the date of a test, and so a lot of people showed up. They thought there was going to be a test that day, and then he told them, there's no test today. And a bunch of those people just got up and left. And so for those remaining, he gave extra credit. So Sam said, this is great. I just know all I have to do is show up, and I'll get all this extra credit. Showing up is certainly required in Jesus' mission, but it's not extra credit. It's not optional. It's a necessary part of what it means to be Jesus' disciple. If we're not actively involved in His mission, we're not being His disciple. Now, over the last 3 weeks, we've introduced you to kind of our working definition of a disciple of Jesus. And that definition was drawn from kind of the entire, the overall thrust of New Testament teaching. And we sort of distilled it down to something for our time and our day. And we developed a definition that reads like this. A disciple is someone who has personal faith in Jesus for salvation. We talked about that a little bit. Someone who's passionately pursuing a relationship with Him. We talked a little bit about that. And someone who is actively involved in His mission. Now, if you were here last week, we talked about how Jesus Himself understood His mission. Because we said, what in the world is His mission? Well, Jesus understood His mission as God. Luke 19:10, where He said, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost." The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. That's His mission. And then we talked about how He gave us a mission. Matthew chapter 28, the famous passage that we call the Great Commission, where He said, "You are to be my missionaries to the world." Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Therefore, you go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely you know I'm with you to the very end of the age." But what we didn't get to last week is how you know the best way for you to be actively involved in Jesus' mission. How do you know what you'll be good at in Jesus' mission so that you can do that thing that you'll be good at as opposed to doing something else or nothing else? So for this week, for much less than 4 hours, as far as you know, we're going to talk about your part in Jesus' mission. And we're going to discover that every one of us is gifted by God to be a part of that mission and to do some amazing things to further His kingdom here on earth and in our community and around the world. But you and I, every one of us, we have to do our part. Jesus told this parable, Matthew chapter 25. If you've got your Bibles, you may want to follow along. We're going to read this sections of this parable. Matthew chapter 25, beginning with verse 14, and we'll kind of unpack this a little bit and what it looks like for us and what we've been given. Matthew chapter 25, beginning with verse 14. Jesus teaching His disciples this parable. He says this, "Again, it'll be like a man who's going on a journey, and he calls his servants, and he entrusted his wealth to them. To the one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And then immediately he went on a journey." So everybody gets something. Even if you feel like you got the consolation prize or you didn't get as much as somebody else, everybody gets something. All 3 of the servants in this story got something. Now, not everyone always gets the same thing, though in this particular story, these servants appear to have received the same thing, only in differing amounts. And I use the sort of traditional translation there of talents, because we call this the parable of the talents. A talent in the Greek language, that word is simply a unit of measure, unit of value, of worth. More than likely, and some of your translations will have this, more than likely this was some sort of money. Even some of your translations will say bags of gold. 5 bags of gold, 2 bags of gold, 1 bag of gold. But the application is certainly not restricted to bags of gold. But if you have bags of gold, we have offering bags, and the 2 go great together. So that'd be a wonderful thing too. So in this parable, anyway, everyone gets something, not the same amount, often not the same, but everybody gets something from God because God is the giver. Everybody gets a gift. So what did you receive from God? Everyone gets a gift. What did you receive from God? 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul kind of talking about gifts that come from God. And he said there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit gives all of them, the Spirit of God. And there are varieties of ministries that you can be involved in, you can do, but the same Lord is Lord of all those. Varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things in all persons. But to each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good, for the mission. One and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually just as He wills. God gives gifts to us. The Spirit of God decides what gifts that we get. He gives to each one individually just as He wills. So everyone gets something to guide and to help and to fulfill your part in Jesus' mission. Now there's an acronym that we use, and there's actually a class, and we've taught this class here in the past, and we'll do so in the future, and the acronym is SHAPE. S-H-A-P-E, kind of an acronym to help us understand what all might be involved in the gifts that God gives to us and how these things might fit together in any of our lives. So the acronym is SHAPE, and sometimes we'll talk about, how has God shaped you for his mission? In other ways, people use some other language. They'll say, how's God wired you for his ministry? A very similar thing, but SHAPE is a pretty good acronym, though it is subject to some misunderstanding. I've got a good friend who's a rather large guy, rather big guy, and sometimes he said people will tell him that he should get in shape. He should get in shape. And he always says back to him, he says, I am in shape. Round is a shape. Round is a shape. So maybe for you and I, maybe for us to be well-rounded in our service for God, we need to understand exactly how God has shaped us for his mission and for the work of his kingdom. So the unique way that you're put together and what you've been given. Now, we'll kind of go through them real quickly. Here's what these things stand for. The S is for spiritual gifts. For spiritual gifts. Now, you may want to write down these passages. Romans chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. I don't think I even put these on the slide. Romans 12, 6 through 8. And the reason I give you these are where there are some sample lists in the Bible of spiritual gifts. So Romans 12, 6 through 8. 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 30. And in there, it's not every spiritual gift. Sometimes people say, well, these are all the spiritual gifts. I don't feel like I have one of those. It's a sample list of spiritual gifts. And it includes things like teaching and serving, giving, knowledge, encouragement, leadership, hospitality, administration, helps, mercy, wisdom, discernment. A sample list, but there are a lot of other things. Spiritual gifts given to you by God that you may use them in his mission, in his service. So S is spiritual gifts. The H is for heart. What has God placed inside of you that you are passionate about? Everybody has something. Sometimes we just don't know, or sometimes we haven't thought about it. What has God placed inside of you that you are passionate about? Some of you may remember there's an old cartoon character named Popeye. You remember Popeye? Not the chicken place. Now, I've made you hungry for lunch, haven't I? You're thinking, Popeye's chicken. No, Popeye the cartoon character, and he was Popeye the Sailor Man, and he was a cartoon back when only children watched cartoons, and we love Popeye. And his passion was injustice, especially bullying, because he was in love with olive oil, and there was a character in the Popeye cartoon called Brutus, and he was a bully. And he was always bullying everybody, and that drove Popeye crazy. And Popeye would say to himself, eventually Popeye would get tired of it, and he would say this great phrase. He would say, that's all I can stands, I can't stands no more. That's all I can stands, I can't stands no more. And then what Popeye would do is he would pull out a can of spinach, and he would eat the spinach, and immediately he would grow these giant muscles, he called them. Muscles, that's his word for muscle. Muscles, he would grow them, and then he would take care of the bully. And I love Popeye, but I always hated spinach. And now I eat spinach all the time, but I think I'm starting to disbelieve the Popeye story because I haven't developed those kind of muscles. But Popeye's passion was for stopping injustice and stopping bullying. And so you might not be Popeye, but you have some area of passion in your life. It might be around helping the hungry or the neglected or the marginalized. It might be around education. It might be around serving those who are older. Whatever your passion would be, your passion might be around the cause of evangelism and seeing the gospel clearly proclaimed to everyone. Whatever it is that fires you up, and you would say, that's all I can stands, I can't stands no more. Heart, what you're passionate about. The A is for abilities. Abilities, talents, skills. What do you do well, and what do you love to do? And how can you glorify God with those abilities? Now, a word of caution, just because you love to do something doesn't necessarily mean you have a lot of ability to do it. Isn't that the hard reality of life? For instance, my wife, Rebecca, loves to sing. Don't get ahead of me here. Have you heard her sing? No, because you're still here. I understand. She loves to sing, but she would tell you maybe she doesn't have that much ability to sing, and that a lot of people may not like to hear her sing, except, of course, for me, because I love every melodious tone that comes out of her mouth. That's why I'm still here. But you have natural gifts and abilities. Some of you are really good with numbers. You love math, numbers and accounting and finance and anything like that. So some of you are really good with numbers. Others of you don't know how many letters are in the word math even, so you don't know. Some of you have musical gifts. Some have athletic gifts and technological gifts, mechanical gifts. Some of you are so gifted you can fix anything. Some of you are more gifted like me. You can break anything. I don't know if that's a gift or not. I feel like I have that. Some of you are good at working with people. Others are better working with stuff. And woe to us if we get those backwards. But you have natural gifts and abilities and talent. And God gave you those things, not just for you to make a living, though you may use them to make a living, and that's great. God also gave you those things to be at work as a part of His mission in His kingdom. You've got natural gifts and abilities. The P stands for personality. Personality. How has God wired you? How many of you, just by show of hands, and I bet this is almost right, how many of you have taken one of the sort of personality tests? It's Myers-Briggs or DISC or, the Enneagram changed your life or whatever it was, okay? You've done some of that stuff. Yeah, you find out things that you're an introvert or an extrovert, you're easygoing or you're driven or you're very emotional or you're very reserved or somewhere in between. God has wired you in a unique way, and God will use you in and through your unique personality. He loves you just like you are. Now, everybody around you may want you to change. Some people may not like your personality, but God loves your personality because God created you that way and God wired you that way. And God made different personalities. They're not right or wrong. They're just different. 1 Corinthians 12:6, God works in different ways through different people, but it's the same God leading you in His mission with your personality. You can't be anybody else. You got to be you, but God loves you and God will use you just like you are. So you got spiritual gifts, you got your heart, your passion, you got your abilities and your talent, you've got your personality, and then the E is your experience. Where have you been? What have you been through? What have you learned? God will use everywhere you've been and all that you've been through and all that you've learned for His glory and His mission. And we use that acronym to talk about that's your shape that you receive from God. But as you think through your shape, you might think, hey, I didn't ask for what I received. Maybe you didn't ask for what you received. Those servants in Matthew 25, they didn't ask for anything they received in that parable. Did you know that? They didn't ask for anything. The master simply decided to give to them the things that he thought they needed to have and to see what they were going to do with those things. And that, of course, will be the issue. What do you do with what God has given you? What do you do with your gifts? Do you put them to work in His mission? And a lot of us discover that what our gifts are, our shape, instead of focusing on how to develop what we've been given, we worry too much about what we haven't been given or about what someone else has been given. So true. As a pastor, it's easy for me to look around, and I can do this in kind of the big picture. I look around, I see some other pastors who seem so amazingly gifted in ways that I'm not, and it's not a far reach, it's not a stretch for me to start thinking and start wishing, I wish I was more gifted like they are. And some of you are going, we understand, Pastor, we wish that too. We know exactly what you're talking about. It's okay, I know who you are. So I think instead of what you gave me, God, and doing everything I can with that and developing that, I start thinking, I wish I had what someone else had. Kind of like the 2-talent servant might have said, 2 talents is nice, but boy, I wish he would have given me 5. He must like that other guy better than me. Maybe you didn't ask for what you received. Maybe you wouldn't choose it. Maybe you wouldn't choose it. I work with, as you might imagine as a pastor, I work with funeral directors a lot. In all the cities that we've been in, churches we've served, you get to know the funeral directors, and I always ask the funeral directors that I work with, how did you get in the funeral business? Because that seems like an odd thing to choose, doesn't it? To be in the funeral business. I mean, granted, right? There's never a downtime in that business. We're always going to live and are going to die, and so as you might guess, for most of them, it's a family business. But it would seem like an odd thing to choose. In Owensboro, there was a lady who was in the funeral business, and there's very many ladies who are kind of running the funeral business. But she was there, and we were riding along in the hearse one day, and I asked her, I said, "What's a nice girl like you doing in the funeral business?" And she said this to me. I'll never forget. She said at my grandmother's funeral when I was a little girl, she said I watched how the funeral directors comforted my grandfather, and she said from that point on, I knew that this was my gift. And this was what I was going to do with my life. And I said, that's really cool. And she went on. She goes, I even had my wedding in the funeral home. I said, pull over, Morticia. You are too creepy, girl, for me. Let me out of this earth. That's crazy. But Jesus' parable teaches us God gives you a particular gift according to your ability, to each according to his ability, and he wants you to use that to further his mission. Maybe you didn't want what you received. You know, especially in that E category for experiences, maybe you didn't want that. You hear people say, you know, experience is the best teacher. That's really not true. Experience gives the test first and then the lesson later. That doesn't really work out so well. And there are some experiences that you've gone through that you say, hey, I didn't want this. None of us would have wanted it. There are some scars that you have in your life that you wish you didn't have. Maybe it was that you lost someone when you were really young. Maybe you lost a parent or even both parents when you were young. Maybe you were the victim of neglect or abuse in some way. Nobody would ever want that. Maybe you suffered with a disease, whether it's cancer or heart problems, or maybe you're in the process of fighting a terrible disease right now, and you know no one would want that. No one would choose that. Maybe your spouse left you, divorced you, cheated on you, or maybe you were the one who did that. And you're left with the memory of those experiences, and you wish now that you wouldn't have done that. But often it's through those very things that God is able to use you most in His mission. Who better to help someone who is suffering than someone who has suffered themselves? Who better to walk beside someone than someone who has already walked that path? Even the things you didn't want to receive have a higher purpose in God's kingdom. All your experiences, the good and the bad, God uses that for His glory. Romans 8:28, famous passage of Scripture. We know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose. That's you. That's you as a follower of Jesus, as one of His disciples, as God's church, called out according to His purpose, committed to follow Jesus with each other, and given gifts to do your part in His mission, even if you didn't want what you received. Here's number 3 in that. Make sure you know what you've received. Make sure you know what you've received. According to the grace given us, Paul writes in Romans 12, we have different gifts. It's important to know what you have so that you can use it to the fullest. If you don't know what you have, if you don't know that what you have comes from God, not only you might not use it to the fullest, you might not even value it very much if you don't know what you have. One of my favorite stories is a story about a man who buys an old house, and he finds a Bible hidden up in the attic of his old house, left there by the previous owner or maybe an owner before them, and he doesn't know anything about it, so he just takes it and gives it to Goodwill. And he's talking to a neighbor of his, and he tells him that story, and his neighbor starts asking him about, well, what year was, the old Bible, what year was the copyright on it? And the man said, well, I couldn't read the number of the copyright. He said, the only thing I could make out is it was printed by Guten somebody. And his neighbor said, you mean Gutenberg? He goes, yeah, I think that was it, Gutenberg. And his neighbor says, oh my goodness, don't you realize what you've done? He goes, Gutenberg's the guy who invented the printing press, for those of you who don't know or are not following the story. And so that Bible might have been one of the first books ever printed. That's probably worth a fortune. And the guy said, well, no, mine's not. He goes, even if that's true, mine's not. He goes, because there was scribbling all over it in German by some guy named Martin Luther, so it's probably not worth anything. It's all messed up. Got to know what you have, what God has given you, how valuable it is. We'll learn in a minute that one of these servants buried the talent that his master gave him, didn't know how valuable it was, didn't see what a great gift it was from God. If you and I are not careful, we can do the same thing. But what God expects you to do is invest that as a part of His mission. Invest what God has given you. Render to God what you have received from Him. Invest that back. Beginning with verse 16, we pick up the parable. Jesus still telling them, the man who had received 5 talents put them to work, and he earned 5 more. In the same way, the man who with 2 earned 2 more. But the man who had received only 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, to understand the parable, you've got to understand the symbolism. The master is Jesus Himself. The servants are followers of Jesus, His disciples, Christians, the church. And He's called all of us to be His servants, and God has gifted every servant, given each of us some ability, some talent, to use that gift and that talent, that ability, and those experiences for God's glory and for His mission. It's God's investment in you. God's investment in you. And you have the ability to be involved in His mission. You have the ability. Zig Ziglar said you're the only person on earth who can use your ability. Now, we don't all have the same amount of ability. We don't all have exactly the same ability. Like the parable, some have 5 talents, some have 2, only 1. And sometimes we look around and you say, oh, I know some 5-talent people. They went to the best schools and they have the perfect marriage and their talents and abilities are recognized in the public sphere and they make a lot of money and they're beautiful and they're handsome. And we hate people like that, don't we? And then there are people who seem like the other side. They have to work, seems like harder than everyone else for everything they have, and they don't seem to have all the best skills, and they don't seem to have the attractiveness that others have, and they don't seem to have a lot going for them. And then there's a lot of other people who would fall somewhere in the middle by our own assessment. This is not God's assessment. This is the way we assess things. God's assessment is He's given everybody a gift, and He's given you an ability, and the question is, are you going to use that to serve Him or not? But you have the ability. He's given you the ability. You also have the opportunity. Big opportunities and small opportunities. All the opportunities that God gives you. Maybe the key is just to see the small things. Hugh Allen's got this great quote. He says, jumping at several small opportunities may get us there more quickly than waiting for one big one to come. Got to be ready at whatever opportunity God opens up for you, because He's going to do that. He's going to open up an opportunity. He'll provide the ability. He'll provide the opportunity. But you've got to understand that you have a responsibility to be involved in Jesus' mission. Each servant given something, expected to do something. We're no different. God's given each of you spiritual gift, heart, a passion, abilities, your personality, your unique experience. And then He opens up all these opportunities for you to glorify and serve Him through using your gifts to serve others. And who does that make us more like? Well, it makes us more like this guy named Jesus, who said that He didn't come to be served, but He came to serve. Historian William McFeely has this great quote. He said, most of us can read the writing on the wall. We just assume it's addressed to someone else. But it's not. This parable is addressed to us. This parable is for us. What God has given you, you have a responsibility to be involved in His mission. And when you invest what God has given you into His kingdom and into His mission, there's a return on that. There's a return on that. God will reward you in His mission. Verse 19, Matthew 25 in this parable. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. You see, you're not only responsible for doing something with the gifts God gave you, one day God will hold all of us accountable for that. So you read the rest of the parable, and the servant with 5 talents said, look, I've earned 5 more. And the master says, well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful with what I gave you, so I'll give you more. The servant with 2 talents approached, and same story. And well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful with what I gave you, I'll give you more. Do you see the test? It's not what gifts you were given. It's not how many gifts you were given or how much you have, but what you do with the gifts you've been given that counts with God. The 5-talent and the 2-talent guy, according to the text, received exactly the same reward in exactly the same words. It's not what you start with that counts. It's what you do with what God has given you. And in the end, there are only 2 kinds of servants, faithful and unfaithful. Not rich and poor, not beautiful and average, not successful and unsuccessful, whatever other categories we come up with. Only 2 kinds of servants, faithful and unfaithful. And what if, just what if, that's the determining factor in whether or not your life is #blessed? What if it's not any of these other things that you think about? But what if it's simply, are you a faithful or an unfaithful servant with all that Jesus has given you in this life for His mission? And then the parable turns to the unfaithful servant. The man who had received 1 talent also approached, and he said, Master, I know you're a difficult man, reaping where you haven't sown and gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your talent in the ground. Look, you have back what is yours. But his master replied to him, you evil, lazy servant. If you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and I gather where I haven't scattered, then you should have at least deposited my money with the bankers, and when I returned, I would have received my money back with interest. His master said, you're lazy. You're lazy. We don't call people lazy much anymore, do we? You know why? Because you can't teach people to be lazy. You either have it or you don't have it. And this guy had it. It's lazy. The master said, you should have invested what I gave you. You put it in the bank. It would have earned a little interest. I remember when my son was growing up, he had a savings account for all these years, for all these years, and a lot of these years covering the recession. So he had this savings account, and we would always get a statement every month, and he earned the same amount of interest every month. I kid you not, it's absolutely true. The interest every month, 0.01. 1 penny every month interest he earned on that savings account. And you know what? They spent 44 cents on a stamp to mail me that letter every time. No wonder the government's broke. It's crazy. You know, back in the day when Jesus is writing this under the Roman Empire, they had a banking system very similar to ours. And you know, what we believe is that if this servant would have done that, put his master's money in the bank, he would have earned somewhere around 6% interest, which would be pretty good for our day, as a matter of fact, right now, not only for theirs. But his master said, there's no excuse for you not investing, not using what I gave you. And he tried to blame the master. And here's the hard lesson. The master wouldn't take his excuse. Instead, the master took what he had away from him and gave it to someone who would use it and invest it. What God has given you, it's not too small, it's not too little. No talent is too small, no task is too trivial for you to use it in the kingdom of God for His glory and for His mission. Someone said the greater danger between the things we think are too small for us to fool with and the things that we think are too great for us to attempt is that we wind up doing absolutely nothing at all, and that's the one thing God won't let you do. He gives us the ability, the opportunity, the responsibility to do our part in the mission, and He will reward you. He'll reward you. You know, we did something on New Year's Day after 23 years of marriage. We bought some new furniture. So we threw out the old couch and love seat. I think I got a picture of it. Show that. That's not really the couch. Some of you are going, I got a couch just like that. You've hurt my feelings now. I'm sorry. We throw them out. We bought a new couch and we bought a new love seat. And this is a great thing. So we bought it on New Year's Day, and because we did that, the store we bought it at has this great deal. And this is an amazing deal. Here's the deal. If it snows 4 inches or more, measured at O'Hare, on February the 2nd, which is next Saturday, then we get all our money back for that purchase. That's absolutely true. So let's pause for a second and pray this morning. Can we do that? That's not really a joke. You need to pray 4 inches of snow Saturday, February 2nd, because if it snows, I'm going to get a big reward. I'm going to get all my money back from that furniture. But that weather forecast, and by the way, the weather forecast as of last night said it was going to snow next Saturday, but that forecast will probably change. And guess what? Even if it doesn't, I don't have any control over that snow or getting that reward of getting my money back. And there's nothing I can do. Now, there's something you can do. You can pray. There's nothing I can do. Can't control it. But God's reward to those of us who follow Jesus depends on what you do. And you can choose to do something with what God has given you. God has given you spiritual gifts. God has given you a passion. God has given you abilities. God has given you a unique personality and unique experiences. God has wired you and shaped you in a certain way, and you have the choice to do something for His glory, to do something for His mission with that. And that choice will give you God's reward. Verse 21, Matthew 25. The master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. You've chosen to do something with them. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's joy." And that choice to follow Jesus and to do your part in His mission, that choice will give you the life that is #blessed.